The term flying saucer was coined by Kenneth Arnold on his June 1947 flight by Mount Rainier. His sighting of 9 craft gave rise to the flying saucer hysteria of the 40s and 50s, but this wasn't the first time there were mass reports of UFOs in the skies. The Old West of the 1800s were filled with stories of flying machines they called airships. And that's what we're looking at today, here at the Insomnia Society. This story takes place on Friday, June 6, 1884, on a remote ranch 35 miles northwest of Benkelman, Nebraska, and it was reported by the Nebraska Nugget and the Daily State Journal of Lincoln. John W. Ellis and 3 other cowboys were on a cattle roundup when they were interrupted by a whirring noise overhead. The 3 men looked up to see a cylinder of metal and fire soar above them, crashing into a nearby ravine. They set off on their horses and soon approached the crash site. In its landing path, every area where the object had touched down, the sand had fused together and was boiling. Coming up on the edge of the ravine, they found it was covered in strange debris. The men described it as cogwheels and blades that were so hot they burnt the ground around them and couldn't be touched. One of the men had decided to lift a piece with a spade and found he could lift the material like a feather. They approached the still burning object, but it was so hot and so bright they couldn't look at it for more than a second. One of the cowboys, named Alf Williamson, dismounted and approached the crash site. Getting within 200 feet of the fiery wreckage, he stuck his head over the edge of the ravine. It was only 30 seconds before he fell unconscious, and the other 3 dragged him back. His hair was singed and his face was red and began to blister. It looked serious, so they brought him to John Ellis's house and called a doctor. In the meantime, they told others, and that night, people from neighboring ranches came to see it. Even though the fire had lessened a little, the object was still shining so bright it couldn't be looked at directly. On the following morning, the crash site was visited by more locals. One of these was E.W. Rawlings, a local cattle brand inspector. He returned to Benkelman to confirm what Ellis and the others were saying was true, and Ellis soon applied at the land office to secure the land so he could examine the craft once it cooled down. June 10th, from a correspondent at the Daily State Journal, we finally figure out what happened to the wreckage. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, a blinding rainstorm came in. Most of the group viewing the ship left, but a dozen stayed and braved the storm. It lasted for half an hour, and once it had cleared, they were shocked to see that the ship had disappeared. The ravine had picked up a small flowing stream about 3 feet deep, and they feared that this current might have carried the light material away. Crossing into the ravine to look for it, they noticed the air had a sweet smell, and in the area where the craft had been, all that remained were pools of a jelly-like substance that grew thinner and thinner until they were carried away by the current. This is a rare one because there's a lot of things that we associate with UFO crashes we see today. They picked up pieces at the crash site and noticed that it was made of this really light aluminum type metal, which is the same thing that's reported in modern day UFO crashes like Roswell in the 40s. Another thing we see is the inclement weather. This is often seen in missing 411 cases. And what missing 411 is, it's a collection of people that have gone missing under strange circumstances in the national parks, which some people believe have to do with cases of alien abduction. We'll definitely be covering a lot of these in a later video, so make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you're notified when the episode comes out. Soon after they go missing, inclement weather will roll in, and that'll either delay the search or call the search off entirely, which may lead to them never being found. The ship also disappeared in the rain, so that just gives us another connection to disappearances in the bad weather. Those who saw the debris described it as cogwheels and other machinery common to the time period. But the only flying machine at that time was the hot air balloon, and that had no engine until the 1900s and very few mechanical parts. So it's unlikely it was one of those that crashed. What you'll see often in older cases like these is that they use the more limited vocabulary they had at the time to describe what they were seeing. and they would describe them how you think somebody from the Old West would describe them. Sometimes it was animals, so snakes and crocodiles and even dragons. Other times it was balls of fire, and other times it was steampunk amalgamations of metal and wood and canvas. But in the 1800s, one thing was for sure. They didn't call them UFOs like we do today. They called them airships. And during the 1800s, they were being seen absolutely everywhere. Our next story takes place in Lodi, California, from an article in the Stockton Evening Mail. On the night of November 25th, 1896, while traveling in a horse-drawn carriage, Colonel Shaw and Mr. Camille Spooner saw three beings on the side of the road. Behind them, a huge cylindrical craft hovered noiseless over a small body of water. The beings didn't wear clothes, but their bodies were covered in a soft, fine fuzz. They were tall and slender, and Shaw noticed that their hands were delicate and their fingers didn't have nails. Their feet were large and slender, and they used them much the same as a monkey would. Shaw went on to describe the beings as having heads and faces without hair, very small ears, and a nose like polished ivory. The eyes were large and shining, and their mulls were small and toothless. Each one carried a small bag under its left arm, to which was attached a hose. And every now and then, a creature would lift it to their face as the sound of escaping gas could be heard from the bag, like a breathing apparatus. They approached the two men on the carriage, and Colonel Shaw reached out to touch one. Placing his hand under the elbow of the creature, he found that it lifted into the air with ease. He tried to communicate and ask where they were from, but they seemed to not understand him and began talking to one another in a warbling tone. They showed Shaw and company what they held in their other hand. It looked like an egg made out of a mineral that glowed with a bright light. Even with its brightness, Shaw found that he could look directly at it without any adverse effects. That's when the creatures tried, and I use this term lightly, to abduct them. At a sign from their suspected leader, two of them pulled at Shaw and Spooner, and although they didn't resist, the creatures were unable to move them, having no muscle power outside the movement of their own limbs. Having failed, they turned back towards the canal and their ship, not walking like you or I, but in a low-gravity jumping motion. Curious, Shaw and Spooner followed them as quickly as they could and made it to the bridge of the canal. From here, the three creatures jumped onto their ship, opened a door inside, and entered. The craft sped off in an expanding contraction motion and vanished. This is another odd one, but it has some too good to be true qualities to it. So, granted it's a true event, Shaw was able to provide a detailed description of the beings. The ivory nose seems like it could have been some sort of mask or helmet, and it's possible that they were clothed, just not that Shaw could tell. There's been some encounters, like the Zanfretta case or the Sandown Clown, which we'll cover, where it's highly suspected that it's a suit of some kind that they're wearing. What first stuck out to me was how he described them hopping away, like astronauts on the moon mission. But then I remembered, around that time period, there were these things called dime store novels. They were these campy pulp fiction books filled with stories of crazy adventures and romance and weird creatures. So it's possible somebody at that time had heard a story of a person in a low-gravity atmosphere and knew what they would act like. It's also unknown whether they were trying to abduct Shaw and Spooner, or merely seeing if they too could lift them like they had been lifted by Shaw not too long earlier. Besides that, it was a fairly peaceful encounter with the aliens seemingly leaving on good terms, which wasn't always the case in the Old West, like we're about to look at. Culture shock is the disorientation that happens when you go somewhere where people do things drastically different than you. Different ways of eating, sleeping, communicating, and sometimes these even include hand gestures. So, for example, a thumbs up in America means good job, but in Australia, the Middle East, and Greece, it means up yours. So, it's possible that this is the same with aliens too. This one comes from Reynolds, Michigan, and it's an article in the Grand Rapids Evening Press on April 16th, 1897. Half a dozen farmers were working in a field when an airship landed nearby. The farmers moved in, excited to see what it was, and a tall gray alien climbed over the side. It spoke to them in an eloquent voice as they approached, but in a language that they couldn't understand. More people gathered at the scene, and the newspaper reported that they not only got a good look at the airship, but also got well acquainted with its pilot. Now, this is weird because he spoke a language that they didn't understand. It's possible this was with some sort of telepathic communication, which they're known to do, or nonverbal hand signals. But this is when things went bad. One of the men approached the alien and stuck out his hand in a gesture of goodwill. Well, the alien took this entirely differently. He either saw it as an insult or saw it as a threat, and swept the man's leg, taking down the farmer and leaving him with a broken hip. Stunned, the rest of the crowd looked on as the alien got back into his ship and shot off into the sky. That would be the end of the story, but on April 24th, about 100 miles away in Pavilion, Michigan, an airship exploded. The flash and subsequent tremors were seen and felt by a number of reputable townsfolk. A shingling operation below where the explosion happened reported debris when they had resumed work the following morning. So, maybe in his absolute shock of an open hand, the being caused some sort of malfunction causing his ship to explode days later. Or it could be an entirely unrelated incident. But let me know what you guys think down in the comments. And if you're interested in the subject, there's an entire line of books by Noé Torres and John LeMay called The Real Cowboys and Aliens, which are a collection of all of these stories. Thank you guys so much for watching. Like, subscribe, and make sure to hit the notification bell, and I look forward to seeing you guys in the next Insomnia Society episode. It gets weird out there, so stay safe, guys.